Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology, spiritual adventure, art, and a wide array of esoteric sciences and modalities, which I'm fascinated with. They all seem to work together very nicely. I've got a great guest coming on today. We'll be talking about the tarot in a few minutes. Before we do, I want to remind you about my newsletter, which goes out every Sunday afternoon. In there, you'll find a couple of paragraphs of mundane astrology, and then I break out into individual signs below that. I also include links to my podcasts, links to my television series where you can learn about astrology firsthand through all the houses and the planets and the signs are all there on my website, turningofthewheel.tv. And I encourage you to do that as well. They're all there for free. And if you feel like you want to support me in some way, there's a big old donate button on there too, which is always helpful to keep the wheels turning. No pun intended. Anyway, my guest today is Edward Mesmer. Yes, you said Edward Mesmer. It's a mesmerizing name. I understand that, but that's okay. He's going to be talking to us today about his website called The Tarot Tells. Welcome to the Turning of the Wheel, Edward. It's nice to have you on today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I've always been fascinated with it. So your website is The Tarot Tells, the TheTarotTells, just one long string of words, tarottells.com.
That's correct.
His name is Edward Mesmer. So I've always been interested in the tarot. I've had many readings done with the tarot. I find it to be a fascinating modality. How did you come to it, and why do you think that it has value?
Well, personally, I was kind of raised around it.
Okay.
It had always been present with my mother. I didn't get into it too much until a little later in life. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, the primary method that I got into initially wasn't the tarot cards. I learned at one point sleight of hand magic just as a hobby. And so I spent a lot of time with playing cards. And it got to the point that I was starting to see patterns where there really technically shouldn't be any. And I'd always had somewhat of an esoteric background. So I thought to myself, well, why can't you read with playing cards? And upon a little investigation, I realized that, yes, that's actually something that's been done for a very long time. Playing cards being really nothing but a modern evolution of the tarot cards. Uh-huh. So I got into reading playing cards. I found them working very well. It got to the point that I couldn't play a game of poker with somebody because I was reading everything into their hand. But eventually it led me to actually learn the tarot cards and get into other systems as well. It's all sortilege. It's all using the random shuffling of objects to interpret that individual person's story. So yeah, that's kind of the strange roundabout way I got introduced into those cards.
Yeah. I've done interviews with people and I've had my cards read. I had my cards read years ago with a regular, good old fashioned 52 card deck. And it was fascinating. And the person I spoke with actually, was a highly regarded card reader in Washington, D.C., and he had done readings for the royal family, as a matter of fact. And so he was highly credible.
Oh, wow.
And I found it to be fascinating because of the whole nature of the randomness in the cards. But what I'm concerned with, what always questions I've always had was how can you explain the random quality of the cards and how they pertain to an individual? Are they more of a reflection or are they more of a direction that someone should take?
Both. really. To me, one of the things I stress whenever I read someone's cards is uh, one, this is not etched in stone, and two, this isn't generally going to tell you anything you don't know.
Okay.
What they serve to do, I believe, is give you a focus and give you some insight maybe into the influences that are affecting your situation that you really, for living your own life, don't have the opportunity to step back and look at. Now, the fascinating thing is that the cards do that, is that they will, through complete randomness, give an accurate outline of someone's life. That's always fascinated me. There are, for my personal beliefs, I'm very into a lot of the like quantum science aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
I've always held this belief that science and magic are really kind of the same thing. The example that I give is if you went back 300 years, could you describe radio and everything we do with it to somebody without getting burned as a witch?
Probably not. Right. Yeah.
Exactly. So the things right now that we regard as magic in another 200-300 years are going to be things that are just regarded as science. And even right now, there's experiments being done that are proving concepts that the esoteric community has always known about, but now science is actually starting to give proof to these things. One of the interesting studies that I've found, or experiments rather, is everyone within the esoteric community is familiar with things like the law of contagion, the law of sympathy, where things maintain a link, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yep.
Did you know that that's been proved through quantum science? The Chinese recently did an experiment with something called quantum entanglement. It was an idea that Einstein initially proposed. He actually called it spooky action at a distance, which I was trying to initially name my website spookyaction.com, but it was taken. And what they did is they basically made two paired particles. They teleported a particle into space, kept one on Earth, and everything that they did, like they adjusted the energy frequency of the particle on Earth, and everything they did to manipulate the particle on Earth was reflected in the particle they teleported into space. That is a scientific demonstration of the law of sympathy.
So that's and when you say teleported, you simply mean they took the particle and put it into space, not necessarily teleporting it, right? I mean, they
did not. They moved it from Earth to space, just with simple teleportation. And I know that sounds wild, and I encourage everybody listening right now to get on Google and look at the quantum entanglement experiments, because it sounds like science fiction, and it absolutely is. But this is legitimately the science that's being done right now.
Mm-hmm. So the random quality that you mentioned, when you do random quality, like, someone goes to your website, thetarottells.com, and they pull up get a free reading right now, boom. How could that apply to millions of people at the same time? That's the same sort of question we get in astrology as well.
That's something that I address, and I try to address a few times, because I'm very big on my website with education. I want people to understand what they're getting, what's going on, what they're doing. And I ask the question, how can a single reading apply to all of these people? And at that point, you are not necessarily reading for someone, you're reading a broad situation at that point. Right. And I explained that if you want more detail as to what this means, because we're all living the same life in the same world. So, yeah, you draw that single card, and it kind of gives a good outline of things.
Sort of a higher view, perhaps.
A higher view. Yeah, that's a good analogy of it. You're basically you're taking a much higher view of it. You're seeing a very broad spectrum. If you want to zoom in a little bit onto you, that's when the actually speaking to me one-on-one,
Right.
getting your cards read, that's where that comes in.
So it's the same idea as in astrology. We can say somebody may be a Gemini or a Pisces or whatever, but we want to know real value. You've got to drill into the real actual birth chart. I get that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Yeah. Perfect. Yep.
Broad strokes. You
Right.
start with broad strokes and you just focus in. I've, for example, I've noticed this concept with the pick a card tarot readings on YouTube.
Right.
And I've recently started producing video content. And at first I was like, this seems weird and kitschy and I don't know. But I thought about it. And like we were just discussing, it's the broad picture.
Right.
But at that point, even over video, that's still going to have some credence. It's still going to give you a good broad picture to go off of. Only now you are allowed a choice as to where to start your reading, instead of doing this big broad, this is a reading for Aquarius, this is a reading for Sagittarius. It's a base question. You get to ask your question and you get to pick, even if you're watching a video, and that's going to have some bearing. That's going to give you that broad picture that you could start further analysis with.
I see. Because you have to admit, this sort of you wonder, I mean, you talk about terms of, I always thought of the tarot as being very magical, and because of the fact that how could any card just randomly appear that has some sort of information or viability for my current or future life? How would that possibly work? What would be the underlying theme that ties that together? I understand the broad strokes. That makes sense because that's how astrology works too. But I also know in astrology it's not until you drill down to the real birth date, place, and time for an individual that you get the more granular information. So you're saying that when you do an individual private reading, you get more granular information that pertains to the individual in person as opposed to a broader sweep.
Yeah, and that's a good way to compare it with an astrology chart versus an actual star chart.
Right.
Like you can say someone's a Gemini, and that's well and good. And yeah, you do see your life mirrored in that, but do you really want to know the exact specific things? That's when you have to contact a professional who is aware of all the intricacies of this. So yeah, that's a good comparison.
Yeah. How do you really think that the tarot actually works? What do you think is the logic behind it? What do you think that really is making the thing work?
I have a couple of ideas on it. I'm very big on chaos, but the thing I always say to people is that chaos is just order we can't understand. It's order too complex for us to really get. So it's kind of like synchronicity.
Yeah.
Like how things just kind of work out as they should. Things kind of fall into place. That's kind of, tarot cards are a really interesting example of synchronicity. And
which is fascinating by itself. I mean, synchronicity is just one of the most amazing things. Depending upon, depending upon the particulars. I've had situations of synchronicity that were so stunning you can't even believe that they've happened.
Yeah, and that's the dawning that a lot of people really get. And I can think of times in my life that synchronicity was so blatant and so in my face that I was just like, well, okay, that's what that is.
Yeah, it's just incredible. I know.
So that I believe is kind of the same thing that's at play with tarot cards. And I used to believe that somebody actually had to physically be there, that there had to be a physical presence of two people involved. And the more experience I got, the more I realized that doesn't necessarily have to be a thing. And one, that completely tanked any theories I had about tarot cards at that point, because I thought it was an energy exchange based on physicality and things like that. And now all of a sudden I figured out that yes, I can accurately read someone's tarot cards 1,500 miles away without them ever being close to me and have it done with accuracy. That throws an interesting wrench into the works. What's that at that point?
I know. That's a very good point. Because how could that possibly be that you're not having the physical connection? They're not choosing the cards. You're choosing the cards for them.
Yeah. Now, a lot of the reason that tarot cards make sense, I believe, and that people are really able to kind of connect with them is, do you know who Carl Jung is?
Yes, of course you do.
There is a direct correlation. I have a fascinating book on the subject of the major arcana and the Jungian psychological development. It's an amazing book, and it talks about how every part of the journey from the fool to the world is an aspect of humanity. Mm-hmm. And all of the minor arcana is aspects of life. So that's kind of, to me, what those two separate card sets in the tarot mean. The major is the human condition, and the minor is simply influences on the human condition. I was told a really interesting way to write based on that idea, and that if you are a writer and you are writing a story and you want characters, pull out the major arcana, shuffle it up, pull out your main characters. You get a complete aspect of being for a character to write about based upon that major arcana. You want to give them some backstory, or you want to see what their struggle is going to be, pull from the minor, throw it on that card, and you have a complete story arc for that character just with tarot cards.
I like that idea. That's very interesting. I never thought of that. That's a very interesting way for generating story ideas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know, when you think about the random quality of it, this is what always stuns me about it. I mean, I've delved into tarot for many years, and I've had a lot of readings, some of which were very accurate, some of which were a little bit off. But I always think there's a little bit of wiggle room with all esoteric and sort of arts like this. There's nothing unusual about that. You know, the degree to which you're going to get accuracy is based on your willingness to understand it and how you interpret it. Oftentimes in astrology, we may tell a story, because I think it's all about telling a story. Your combination of cards are about telling a story. Astrology was the same way. It's about telling a story. How that story is interpreted is up to the person who's interpreting. In your case, the tarot reader. In my case, the astrologer. But in that kernel of the story may not parlay exactly to the person who you're reading for, but in the germ of the story, the theme is underlying. It's always going to be there. You may use different metaphors and different languages to describe it, but the theme will always be there. It'll be about a major overarching theme that is present, and it's up to the individual who's getting the reading to then apply it to their lives so that it's accurate.
It's true. And it's interesting that you say the story, because people ask me sometimes, how do you learn to read? How do you practice? Right. What do you do? I told myself stories. Yeah. Like every time I would lay out a spread, I would look at it and what is this person's story? Exactly. And I would just generate a story in my head based upon that reading that I saw. Mm-hmm. And that's all you have to do.
And your story that you invent may not apply to the person you're reading it for, but the underlying theme will apply.
It's the same reason that we see moral tales and connect with fairy tales and books and stories. Stories are made to see yourself in quite often. And that's... To be able to just give someone a story that they can reflect on is sometimes a little better than saying, like, this is
exactly
where you stand. This is how things are for you. Tell them a story about what's going on in the cards. People understand subtlety. You don't have to be like, this story is about you. Right. They'll understand. They will see the parts of their life that are reflected in the cards. Mm-hmm. And in giving them a story, I think it'll help that lesson stick. Like, because just giving someone information and advice, they'll take some of it to heart, but they'll forget a lot of it. You tell someone an amusing story that they can apply to that current situation, they'll remember it. Generally, if you can make someone laugh or smile or feel something during their reading, you're going to ensure that they take those lessons away.
Right. It has to leave some sort of an impression that resonates with their personal experience. And
Exactly.
that's why I say the story is a vague story, much the way a lot of the famous stories are vague stories. But life is a series of stories because it's how we live them and create them through experiences. And experiences are validated by our own narrative and how we pursue that story in our lives.
Well, it's interesting to think. Have you ever heard of, I'm probably getting this number wrong, and someone's going to correct me. It's the 33 Tales, I believe.
I don't know that.
It's the idea that humanity has ever told 33 stories, and that all of our stories are evolutions of those. It's like
Right. It's the same story, just different time and place.
It's man versus nature, man versus man,
Right.
man versus himself, that type of thing. It never changes. The human struggle never changes,
Exactly.
which is, I believe, part of why tarot is actually able to kind of give perspective, because we want to think our situation is unique to us and that no one struggled the struggle that we struggled before.
Right. But that's a fallacy.
But it's a fallacy. Everyone has. People have been through what you've been through countless times before.
Exactly.
And those cards are kind of a culmination of those lessons. Like someone's been there before. There's wisdom to be had in it. Everyone knows what it's like.
Right. The way I sort of describe that when I talk to people about it is I think of as time as a giant corkscrew. And so you think of time as a giant corkscrew. So things are going around and around and around, and there's a cyclical, repetitive nature to them, yes, but don't forget that circle is still moving at the same time forward. So you're always moving forward. So the time and place and scene and greater setting of your life will change, but that the story remains the same all the way since the Odyssey and the Iliad, going back even further than that. These stories are all the same. They're just told in a different place and time with different contemporary tools.
Exactly, and that's why people will connect so deeply with stories. You're going to see your own personal struggle in that story because you've went through it.
Right.
That's why stories work. Stories work based on that connection.
I'd heard of the 7 different plots. I never heard of the 33, but 33 is more accurate, it seems like, because the 7 different plots that I always heard of were like boy meets girl, girl meets boy, blah, blah, blah. Sort of the typical ones. I think the 33 is far more in depth because it probably encompasses more of the actual human condition. Because we all go through peaks and valleys. We all have highs and lows. We all have challenges, assets, and liabilities in each of us. And none of us has any more than any other. We're all fairly much common in that regard. We just have them in different areas. We have different talents, different skill sets, different, as I said, liabilities and assets. So the 33 Tales makes more sense to me because it's a wider pool of stories. But I do believe it all comes back down to the story.
Yeah, there's only so many situations a human could live, really, and it's greater versions of it. There's lesser versions of it, but it's all the same.
Yeah. And it's the ability of the interpreter to find that story and properly relay it to the person so that they can glean from it the lesson that needs to be learned or the lesson that's being taught by it. And that is the secret because, when you look at the tarot deck, they're all sort of many, depending upon which deck you use, they're often ancient pictures of knights and castles and the fool and the death and all these, and they're all these odd, older symbols and symbolism. But those symbols and symbolism still apply today because they are just contemporary. We may think of them in different terms. We'd use contemporary terms to describe what looks like a hardship for somebody else or an easy time for somebody else. We would use contemporary terms to define them, whereas they...
I actually use a very contemporary deck. All of my tarot decks are very unusual because previous to this, I was an artist by trade. So I kind of got into that aspect of things. And the main deck that I read with is very, very contemporary.
Okay.
And the imagery matches up very well. For example, my Wheel of Fortune is an open revolver cylinder.
Okay.
My Chariot is a 69 Charger.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an old. It was called the Darkana Tarot deck. It was a Kickstarter deck a couple years ago, but it's very grungy and contemporary. But the reason I like it is because rather than have that medieval imagery of castles and peasants, this has modern imagery which people can understand.
Right. It makes it more relevant to their daily lives. They can apply. They can envision themselves in a Charger, or without a problem, and they can envision sort of the Russian roulette of the revolver chamber.
Exactly. And like I think the Ten of Wands is a logging truck.
Okay, interesting.
The burden of the truck.
Yep.
So,
but that illustrates the point. That illustrates the theme that you're extracting from the deck when you find the reading. That's the story you're finding, and you're illustrating it and making it contemporary so people can understand it.
Exactly, and that's why whenever somebody asks me like, "Oh, what deck do you use? I need to get that." No, you don't. Like, you need to get the deck that resonates with you, the deck that you can look at the imagery of the Fool or the Magician and be like, oh, I understand what that means, just based on that image that I see.
Yeah.
So you have to go through just countless decks and look for the one that just stands out to you.
It resonates to you. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And what resonates with you might not be the one you like or the one that you want. I have a close friend who is a very, very masculine man, very assured in his masculinity, but he reads with the fairy tarot.
Oh wow, interesting.
And he's a little. He doesn't understand. He's like, man, I'm not proud of it, but this is my deck.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it applies to him and he sees reason and value in it, then there really is no reason to question it.
And that's what he explains is this is the deck that speaks to me. Like it doesn't for anything else. Is that's just the one that he understands when seeing the cards out in front of him, and that's all that matters.
But when you come down to the when you do a draw, and you must have a pattern. What's your pattern look like when you do a draw?
My basic layout?
Yeah.
A cross with, not the standard Celtic cross. I use a 7-card layout, and I will have my signifier card in the middle. I will have my internal emotional influences to the left of it, my external world influences to the right of it. At the top, I will have your past, which has bearing on your current situation.
Right.
The next card is the likelihood of the near future based upon your situation. And the final card, not the final card, the next final card is the outcome.
Okay.
Now, the 7th card that I do, I didn't always do, but for some reason it just started popping up. I flip the deck over, look at the bottom card, and that card is your opposition, basically what's going to stand in your way,
or your challenges.
Your challenges, exactly. And I point out to people that it can that card can be a very interesting card because that card's not always going to sound negative. What if the card that you pull is one of the pleasant cup cards, like has nostalgia or friendship? Well, that can get in your way. If you spend too much time having a good time or reflecting on the past, that's going to affect your future. So that's the thing you have to look out for.
Interesting. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. We're talking today with Edward Mesmer. He is the guy behind the Tarot Tells, thetarottells.com. It's TheTarotTells, the Tarot Tells, just one long string of words, tarottells.com. Take a quick break here. We'll be back in a few minutes to continue our discussion, so hang in there. Okay, very good. What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity.
Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
As the world shrinks and our barriers come down, diverse cultures are striving for harmony, balance, and peace. To ease the transition, we need to expand with color, light, and tolerance. Now, you can become a global citizen and embrace the color and clear spirit with the divine artwork of the mandala. Mandalas are a timeless artistic offering for creating unity, harmony, and peace. My name is Chris Flisher, and I've spent years creating mandalas, and they are now available online at www.turningofthewheel.com. Come and experience the world of color, form, and function with t-shirts, coffee mugs, note cards, and limited edition prints. These vibrant, lively paintings and products express optimism, oneness, and spiritual balance for all who use them. www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. And enter a world of possibility and color.
Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My guest today is Edward Mesmer, just like mesmerized. He's heard that joke before, I'm sure.
Never.
Never. And his website is The Tarot Tells. The Tarot Tells. The Tarot Tells. The TheTarotTells.com. And he is there offering tarot readings for people. And we're discussing the whole concept of tarot. And what has always fascinated with me, and I suppose that why I've leaned more towards astrology than perhaps tarot as a modality for which I depend upon, is because I was always concerned. There's a certain piece of me that's very skeptical about the randomness, and I didn't quite understand. Even though I'm a firm believer in synchronicity, I'm a firm believer in all the esoteric arts, I always stuck on this idea of the randomness because of you choosing the cards. And so what do you think is the interchange that's happening when you sit down with somebody in person and they choose their cards? What do you think is the message there? What is the vehicle that makes that whole sort of interchange work?
I believe a lot of it is going to come down to reader intuition. And it's how you said that you've had good readings and you've had bad readings. Well, if the cards are the cards and that they always lay how they need to, how do you get a bad reading?
That's what I was just going to say. I'm just going to ask you that.
Exactly. Well, the answer to that is reader interpretation.
What you don't want to hear, perhaps. Yeah.
What you don't want to hear.
Yeah.
Maybe that person, because I found that you really can't question your gut. Every time I've kind of sat there and been like, oh, this might not mean this. No, it meant that. You're wrong.
Exactly. No, you've got to trust your gut. I totally get that. Yeah.
You got to trust your gut on it. And what really boils down to the reader, and this is one of the things I warn people about on my website, because I have a page dedicated to warning people about basically charlatanism.
Right.
And there is a thing out there, and it's part of the reason tarot cards can effectively be used to grift someone, is have you ever heard of something called a Barnum statement?
No, I think, but that does sound familiar though in some ways. Yeah, go ahead.
P.T. Barnum, which everyone knows about Barnum, evolved a series of 12 statements, I believe, which was things that you could say to people that 80% of the population believed was about them, but it was just a blanket statement.
Okay.
And a lot of kind of shady tarot readers out there rely on Barnum statements. It's simple things like, you've had a lot of trouble in your life.
Of course, yeah.
Of course you have.
Yeah,
You're
of course.
human. Nobody's had a great time of it. That's part of the human condition.
Right.
But it's things that...
Well, the statements are so broad that they would apply to anyone.
Exactly.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
They're things that
I've run
every
across this
single
with
person's
psychics.
gone through.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, a lot of almost all of the charlatanism in psychics is based on the Barnum statement.
Right.
And I very much encourage people to go look at what the Barnum statements are. Educate yourself a little bit. So if you know that the person you're speaking to is just feeding you broad strokes, it's like we said earlier in the conversation, it starts with the broad strokes.
Yeah.
But you can very easily be convinced that this person has a connection to you because this person is just spouting off things on the human condition.
Right. It was P.T. Barnum who said, "A fool is born every minute." So that's
Yep, that's it. And I really encourage everyone to read about P.T. Barnum.
Yeah, I think that's a good value.
Don't watch the movie.
Well, it's important because he sort of delved in this realm of fantasy because of the idea of the circus, and he had people like this within his troops when he traveled across country. And people are prone to this because they want an answer. It's the same sort of answer that I guess in some ways organized religion provides for some people. They're looking for something that they can hang on to.
Well, and one of the things that I always personally keep in mind with providing my services, and I stress this to anyone that works with me, is if they've gotten to the point that they are calling me or you, they want answers. They're concerned.
They're not in a point of trial.
They're in a point of trial. Yeah. They're in a very, I don't want to say weak spot in their life,
vulnerable.
But they're vulnerable.
Yeah,
exactly. They're vulnerable. And all of these grifters and con artists know that and could take advantage of it. Mm-hmm. And it's been done for time immemorial. But what we do is important because of that. I read an article recently that more and more people are turning to astrology rather than therapy and counseling.
Right.
And really, I can understand that because what's a psychic or a cardist or an astrologer going to do that a therapist isn't? A therapist is just going to sit there and listen to you talk. At least somebody that's reading your cards is going to get some insight on your situation and be able to talk with you about it. You're going to get an exchange rather than a sounding board.
Right.
So
in many ways, they provide more. But what's interesting is that if I look over the demographics of people that I've given readings to over the many years I've done readings, the one demographic that stands out the most is the person who's the psychologist. I've had more psychologists come to me for readings than any other demographic of individuals if I had to parse them out into terms of what their occupation was.
They all know about Carl Jung.
Yeah, they know.
They're all taught up to Jungian psychology is
spot on.
Is spot on. It's great. And in the end, you read enough about Carl Jung, you start to read about how he had his palm read. He got his cards read. He spoke to astrologers. So of course, yes, the people that are from his school of thought, how long does it take you to be like, well, if Carl Jung did it and I'm following everything else that he taught, why don't I investigate this aspect? So I could see that. That makes sense.
Yeah, it really is. It's really, and I think that the idea that the people are going to be hearing what they want. But, no one comes to me when everything is hunky-dory. They're all coming to me when they're looking for love. They lost their job or they want something in their life they want some guidance somewhere, some long-term guidance as to whether or not they're going in the right direction. And more often than not, I provide validation in an optimistic way that substantiates their path. Oftentimes people are going in the right direction. There's sometimes when they're not because they've been led by parents or whatever, but oftentimes they are going in the right path. They just don't know it. So they need to hear that. And I think your point of offering valuable stories and knowledge and sort of validation to where a person is far more validating than sitting there listening to a therapist who just sits there and takes notes down and asks questions, which are fairly asked. I mean, some of the questions I've been in therapy. Some of the questions that have been asked of me in therapy are the same sort of questions that an astrologer would ask, or I have asked myself as an astrologer. So
absolutely. Yeah. But the only difference is this therapist has a notebook in front of them. At least this tarot reader has a blueprint of your situation in front of them.
And the timing is there, yeah.
Beyond what you're telling this person, this card spread in front of me tells me things about your situation from a broader scope than what you're able to look at, because you can't see the forest for the trees. Right. You have to be able to take a step back. And that's what the cards give you. They give you that step back, and having the other person to sit there and talk that over with you. Because first and foremost, this field of astrology and psychic reading and tarot reading, this is a counseling job. 100%. People are coming, they're not coming like, hey, just checking up, just want to get my cards read real fast. They're coming because they have a problem that they need to talk about. They have a problem that they need answers to. No one runs to a tarot reader when things are going 100% perfect.
I know, that's the same thing with astrology. So I'm wondering, if someone comes to you and they have a question and you pull a card, in an answer to that question. I mean, do you do that sort of one-on-one where you say, I've got a question? I see you've got yes-no tarot, so that must be a black and white decision where you say,
yes,
does she love me? Does she not love me? Something like that.
Yeah. And what I say in the description of my yes-no tarot reading, because I've discovered that that's actually very popular, is...
Well, it's a quick answer, yeah.
Yeah, it's a quick answer. It's a good basis for further reading. But it's people want a simple answer. They want validation.
Yeah.
That's really a core part of the human condition. We want validation. We want to know that the choices we're making are correct.
Right.
Because there's really no one you can speak to about that. And in a way, consulting the cards about that, you are getting a completely unbiased opinion as to if you're making the right choices, because you're not asking me, you're asking my cards, and I'm telling you what my cards are telling you.
But how does that connection between the person's question and the cards actually work? This is where I always stumble down. When I cast an astrology chart based on a birth date, place, and time, I've got some hard, fast data from which I'm extracting a composite view of what the person's like. And as I get talking to them, and they don't know me, they're much the way you are with your clients, I start talking to them about their chart, and I say, don't tell me anything, just let me read your chart. And the information starts to flow, and it's like, wow, that's real, that's real. How do you get that same sort of authenticity, sort of granular, granular proof from the tarot cards?
Well, two things. One, on my own, like if you were to say randomly encounter me at a festival or reading at a shop or something like that, I prefer you don't ask me a question. I prefer that you just let the cards say what they want to say.
Okay.
I will answer. Questions are fine, but at that point, you give the situation a lens.
Yeah.
A lens.
Yeah, I get
like
that. Yeah.
Telling me nothing versus asking me, is my boyfriend cheating on me? Well, the reason that answer changes based upon that card reading is you've now given me a lens to look through the situation through.
Right, you've added a layer that's not necessary. Yeah, it removes some of the authenticity.
It removes some of the authenticity in a way, but like it changes it a little bit. Like the King of Swords in a broad reading versus the King of Swords and is my husband faithful is going to mean some different things. But I generally prefer, and anyone listening right now that would like to get a reading from me, the best way to get a reading is just cold. And the little questionnaire that you fill out to get a reading off my site, just leave it blank, say open, because I think you have to fill it out, and just let the cards say what they say. You will 9 times out of 10 get your question answered without having to tell me anything. And at that point, the answers to me would have more value.
Right.
If somebody answered my question without me asking, that one means your situation is as important as you think, and two gives validity to that method.
Yeah, it's sort of it's instant validation when you get that immediate. When the response is like that, it's very very fulfilling.
Well, and that to me was what showed me that the cards had validity, is that I wasn't asking people questions and I was scaring people.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there is an element of that. Yeah, I could see that.
Some people get freaked out with the whole, how did you know that? Well, I didn't. I just looked at what came out and surprise, it works.
Well, you know what it may be? It may be that there's a level of a frequency of some sort that operates that is far more viable and authentic and verifiable than we have any knowledge of, because we're too wrapped up in our daily swirl. It's sort of the...
Well, exactly. It goes back to the quantum science thing. And there's a book that I recommend everyone listening and yourself read if you haven't already. Have you ever heard of a man named Dr. Dean Radin?
I don't think so, no.
He is in charge of, I think it's called the Institute of Noetic Sciences.
Oh, I know the Institute of Noetic Sciences, yeah. Okay.
He's the head of them. He wrote a book called Real Magic, and it is the scientific basis of magic as we know it. He is doing the research and is getting statistically significant results from everything from voodoo dolls to blessing tea. Wow. And the information in that book is fascinating because it's not based on esoteric text or anything like that. This man is simply just doing hard science and getting results. And he talks about synchronicity, and he talks about why the cards work and things like that. And what, like you said, there's an underlying thing that these are getting in touch with. We're figuring out that there really is. There's energy exchanges. There's all manner of everything going on at the quantum level that we're just now just dipping our toe in the water of. And that's where the answers are going to be. Like, I wouldn't be surprised in 50 years somebody else having this conversation can be like, of course tarot cards work. It's based on this principle. So that's important. Then it's inspiring to see that this man, who is not just some random person with a doctorate, he's had defense contracts, he's worked for the government. This man, not to say that working for the government automatically validates you, but it's
no argument here.
But what he's purporting and what he's researching is solid enough that entities that classically have absolutely no interest in this subject of things are taking interest.
Interesting. Wow. So he's sort of validating many things, right? He's providing scientific proof for what we hold as being esoteric and untouchable.
Yes. And the opening chapter of the book starts with a story. I think it's a news story that's from like the year 2400, and it talks about all of these things that are magic principles as if they were normal news. And it goes into, in this amount of time, this will likely just be normal news. Like, I tell people, look at your smartphone. Do you know the wild backflips of technology that had to go into making that happen?
Unbelievable.
There are literally gemstones powering your smartphone. That's such a mind-blowing piece of technology, and it's operating off what I mentioned before, radio waves.
Right.
Like, to tell a person in the 1600s that you have a little screen in your pocket that lets you talk to anyone in the world and gives you
They
all
don't
the
even know what they
information.
don't even know what a screen is, let alone.
No,
Yeah.
show it to them. You will get burned pretty quick.
Oh yeah, you'll be long gone. Yeah.
And so, what's to stop somebody from the year 2400? What are they going to have? And it's high. I forget who said this, but at its highest level, technology is indistinguishable from magic,
That makes sense.
which is
Yeah.
kind of true.
Yeah, of course it is.
And the things that we're dealing with, I like to stress that I'm not necessarily special in any way. These are all things everyone can do.
Right. I think that's true.
Every human walking the earth has this connection and has this specialty. And no matter what you believe at all, humans are different. There's something odd about them.
Well, we have empathy, we have intuition. I think those two things are really big.
Yes. And we have weird things. Like I heard us one time referred to as homo nihilus, in that we are the only species that is aware of its own death.
Yeah, or the only species that spends time getting depressed or whatever,
Exactly.
Right, thinking too much, perhaps, because we have so much brain power that we allow us to go in those areas. So, yeah, I think you're right. But your comment about the phone and the phone being magic, I mean, you're right. If we brought that back to the 1600s and we showed somebody this phone, they would think it was magic. We would be toast. We'd be burned at the stake, no question about it. But the same idea that the phone is magic, I think, lends credence to the fact that the esoteric arts are also magic. Because if we can that's the whole connection. That's why it works.
I don't think the esoteric arts will remain the esoteric arts. I think, given natural human progression, it will simply become law, how it is. The laws that we acknowledge as simple things to rule our existence, sympathy, contagion, all of that, that's just going to be the way people live. That's going to be acknowledged laws because it's provable. It's a way. It's an interesting thing because I don't necessarily like the word magic because
I know it implies sleight of hand.
It implies so much, not just sleight of hand, but like Harry Potter and things like that.
Right.
People.
It also implies a sense of trickery, I think, too.
Exactly. Exactly. You're going to go one or two ways with most people whenever you use the word magic. They're going to think David Blaine or they're going to think Harry Potter.
Right.
And both of those are lies in the end.
Well, they're fiction. They're fiction. Yeah.
They're fiction. Exactly. So I've yet to come up with a better word for it. I don't know if there is a better word for it, but the things we acknowledge as magic today will eventually, I think, come to be the accepted status quo.
Right. I mean, magic in some ways is just a way of explaining that which can't be explained.
Yeah, absolutely.
And once you find an explanation for it, then it's no longer magic.
Exactly. And that's happened throughout history.
And we could say that the phone is magic, and now when you go into the engineering, you see the blueprints and you see the way the digital stack works and this RAM and everything else, and then you say, okay, well it's not magic anymore, it's real. So that's the same sort of conversation. I can see that happening.
Well, and it boils down to your average person. Throw a smartphone on the table in front of them. Tell me, or to say to them, how does that work?
Yeah, they don't have any idea.
I know a decent amount about smartphones and technology, and I still couldn't give you anything approaching a decent explanation as to exactly why this item works.
I've got a pretty good idea how they work too, and I struggle with the same things. I mean, just the simple fact of, the GPS alone is enough to blow your mind.
Yeah, there's a satellite orbiting the Earth that's telling your phone where it is.
And that's one of how many phones on planet Earth, and they all know where they are. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. So that in itself is fascinating. When you do a tarot reading for someone and they contact you, do you think of it as a reflective process or is it a predictive process?
A little of both. Um, there's a lot of reflection when I read cards. And I used to draw my cards out one at a time. And I still will for face-to-face readings. But generally, if I'm reading a paid reading over the phone, and because I'm not trying to milk you for money, I'm going to throw all 7 cards out at once. And that way, instead of developing this story as new cards get laid out, I can see all of the story out in front of me and give you an interpretation based on what I see.
Right. And people don't typically come to you for a sort of, I do a couple of readings. I do what's called the owner's manual as an astrology reading, which is sort of giving me just the natal chart and helping a person understand their assets and liabilities. And then I do one that's called a glimpse in time, which is more of a reflective one, which says this is predictive of where you'll be in the future. And when people come to you, do they do that sort of tell me who I am thing or tell me where I'm going thing?
I have had that happen. I've had people want to know about themselves rather than a situation. Generally, when it comes to that point, when you aren't wanting a situational thing with me, when you are wanting more of you're basically coming to me for astrological purposes.
Yep.
At that point, my reading is going to change. That's the point where I'll start using different decks of cards to give more of a broad spectrum, because I've spent multiple hours reading somebody, just reading their runes and then reading their cards and then clarifying that with one of my oracle decks and like doing a broader spectrum reading over here. You can keep delving into it. And what's interesting to me is that each method of reading has its own feel. It has what it wants to say more. Like, people will ask me for rune readings because I studied it's the Anglo-Saxon rune set.
Yeah, I know the runes.
Yeah. And those will give you the coldest answers possible.
Okay.
They don't dance around and tell stories like the cards do. There's no whimsy in the runes. The runes will simply tell you a situation, and they're very, very good for it. But I find that runic readings are a great way to build off of, because they are such a stone cold broad stroke affair. The runes are old. The runes are very, very, very old. And there's something to them. There's an interesting aspect to the runes that I can't really put into words that's not present in things like tarot cards or playing cards.
They have it's a similar sort of divination tool, right?
Yes. The feel of them is different. The feel of them is much older. They're very straightforward, I guess would be the best way to put it, at least in my experience. Runes are different for everyone. I have different oracle decks that I'll use for different purposes. The pick a card reading that I am working on uploading, I've had some issues with file transfer on it, but it should be up within the next 24 hours. I use one of my oracle decks to do a pick a card with, which was a little tricky because, as I explained in the video, these aren't tarot cards. They're nothing like them. They use different symbology.
Right, yep.
They're a whole different card in general. But I thought that would be an interesting way to kind of introduce with my own site a way to do the pick a card reading. I probably won't continue to use those cards, but as an initial showing someone, I thought it would be kind of neat because they're very unusual cards.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a lot to be said there, and I think that one of the things that I come away with this conversation with the loudest is the idea of the intuition and the gut. I think that much of what we need to know. We already do know. It's just a matter of having the doubt, and we need that. I think what the tarot and the astrology and all the other divination tools rather does is fills in that blank and gives you the validation that yes, this is what you're supposed to do. And why we need that validation is probably getting back to what you had mentioned earlier about how we are unusual as a species because we have this ability to think and sort of form these opinions where other species don't have that. So when we get that validation, that sort of completes the circle.
Yeah.
And then we're able to move forward within that. So that kind of makes perfect sense to me. And, I've always said all the time when I'm doing astrology, I say, always trust your gut. It'll never let you down. And, the question is, which way do you go with that? You've got to have a really firm, solid commitment to believing your gut. And that sometimes is hard for people. That's why they reach out to the tarot to get that validation.
Well, have you ever heard, as kind of a closing thing, of Occam's razor?
I was thinking about that this morning. Why don't you run that by me real quick again?
Well, I believe in this so strongly that I actually have a tattoo on my body for this.
Okay.
Occam's razor is a scientific principle that says that the simplest solution is the correct one. That your intuition, the answer that you feel inside is right, is usually the right one. Because if you think about most situations you've been in that you've made a mistake, you double guessed yourself.
Right.
You
probably knew it was
rethought.
wrong before you even went into it, and you did it anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you think back further, you think about that first gut feeling that, I should have done it this way. That was the right one. So trust your gut, trust your instinct, trust your intuition.
And if you need validation, that's when the tarot comes in. That's where astrology comes in.
That's where it comes in, exactly.
Hey, that's been great. Listen, my guest today has been Edward Mesmer. It's Mesmer, just like mesmerized.
Mesmer.
And his website is the Tarot Tells, TheTarotTells, just like it sounds, the TarotTells.com, the TarotTells.com. I encourage you to reach out if you're curious about the tarot. It's a good place to start. So thanks so much again today for coming on, Edward. I really appreciate it, and we had a good conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, okay, very good. And that's the story for today, folks, so thank you so much.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.